This dashcam footage would later become the centerpiece of a federal investigation that would expose years of corruption, abuse of power, and systematic misconduct within the prison system. But in that moment, Officer James Morrison had no idea that his one careless decision would destroy his career, land him in federal prison, and spark a national conversation about accountability behind bars. The timestamp read 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon when inmate David Chen was being transferred from one facility to another. The transport vehicle, a standard prison van equipped with multiple cameras and GPS tracking, was supposed to be one of the safest places in the entire correctional system. Instead, it became ground zero for a moment that would change everything. Officer James Morrison had been working in corrections for 18 years. On paper, he looked like an exemplary employee with commendations, positive performance reviews, and a reputation as someone who knew how to handle inmates. What his supervisors didn't know, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that Morrison had developed a troubling pattern of abusing his authority behind closed doors where he thought no one was watching. David Chen was serving a 3-year sentence for a white-collar crime. He wasn't a violent offender or a career criminal. He was an accountant who had made poor decisions that landed him in federal prison. During his incarceration, he had been a model prisoner. No infractions, no problems, no incidents. He attended educational programs, worked in the prison library, and kept to himself. He was exactly the kind of inmate that correctional officers were trained to handle with basic professional standards. But Officer Morrison saw something different when he looked at David Chen. He saw someone who carried himself with a certain dignity despite being incarcerated. Chen had a college education, came from a successful family, and had connections to people on the outside. Morrison, who had worked his way up from nothing, seemed to take personal offense at the idea of an educated professional sharing the same space as him, even if only temporarily in a prison transport van. The van left the federal detention center at exactly 3:15 p.m., carrying 5 inmates, including David Chen and 2 correctional officers, Morrison and his partner, Officer Sarah Mitchell. Mitchell was relatively new to the job, only 2 years into her corrections career, but she had already established herself as a professional who took her responsibilities seriously. She conducted her job by the book, treated inmates with basic respect while maintaining security, and had never been the subject of a complaint. Morrison, however, had received 7 complaints over his 18-year career, all involving allegations of inappropriate treatment or excessive force. Every single complaint had been dismissed or minimized by internal affairs investigators who seemed more interested in protecting the institution than addressing legitimate concerns. One complaint came from an inmate who claimed Morrison had punched him during a cell search. Another came from a family member who described visiting an inmate with unexplained bruises after a confrontation with Morrison. A third came from another correctional officer who witnessed Morrison verbally abusing inmates during a transport. All 7 complaints had disappeared into the prison system's internal bureaucracy without consequence. No investigations, no discipline, no accountability. Morrison had learned that he could operate with impunity as long as he didn't do anything obviously criminal in front of witnesses who mattered, like supervisors or cameras that anyone important would review. 20 minutes into the transport, Morrison made his first mistake. He made a comment to Mitchell about David Chen, saying something along the lines of, "These educated types always think they're better than everyone else." Mitchell didn't respond, which should have signaled to Morrison that his comment was inappropriate. But Morrison took her silence as tacit agreement and continued. He began making increasingly hostile comments about Chen, questioning his intelligence despite Chen's obvious education, and suggesting that his crime probably involved stealing from regular people. David Chen, who was sitting in the secure compartment of the van separated from the officers by a metal grate, remained silent and still. He had learned during his time in prison that engaging with hostile officers only made situations worse. Silence was survival, compliance was safety, invisibility was protection. But Officer Morrison wasn't satisfied with verbal harassment. He wanted a reaction. He wanted David Chen to show some sign of the fear or intimidation that Morrison believed he deserved to inspire. When verbal abuse didn't produce the desired result, Morrison decided to escalate. The van pulled into a rest stop, as was standard procedure for longer transports. The other three inmates remained in the secure compartment while Morrison and Mitchell stepped out for a brief break. Mitchell walked to use the restroom while Morrison stood outside, smoking a cigarette and stewing in his own resentment toward David Chen. When Mitchell returned, Morrison told her they needed to conduct a security search of the van's interior. This wasn't part of standard procedure for a transport of this length, but Mitchell, being new and uncertain of her authority, didn't question the directive from her more experienced partner. She assumed Morrison knew what he was doing. What happened next was captured in exquisite detail by the van's security cameras, cameras that Morrison apparently forgot existed, or perhaps thought only captured video without audio. The dashcam footage would later show everything with crystal clarity. Morrison unlocked the secure compartment and ordered David Chen out of the van. Chen complied without hesitation or resistance. Morrison told him they were conducting a security search and instructed Chen to stand facing the van with his hands on top of it in a search position. The search was completely unnecessary and unauthorized. David Chen had been secured in a locked compartment the entire transport. There was no logical security reason to search him, but Morrison wasn't conducting a search based on security protocols. He was conducting a search based on personal animus and a desire to humiliate a man he perceived as having some kind of unearned superiority. Morrison's hands became unnecessarily aggressive during the search. He groped areas that had no security purpose. He made comments about Chen's body and his appearance. When Chen flinched slightly during an inappropriate pat-down, Morrison accused him of resisting and shoved him hard against the van. Officer Mitchell, watching this unfold, began to realize something was very wrong. This wasn't standard procedure. This wasn't professional conduct. This was something else entirely, something that violated basic standards of treatment and decency. But Mitchell was new. She was uncertain. She was working with someone who outranked her in experience and institutional knowledge. She made the decision that would protect her career but haunt her conscience. She said nothing and did nothing to stop Morrison's abuse. What Morrison didn't know was that the dashcam footage had audio capability, and more importantly, the van's security system was monitored in real time by a control center back at the main facility. Two dispatchers were watching the live video feed when Morrison's behavior suddenly shifted from standard to obviously inappropriate. The moment Morrison shoved David Chen against the van, one of the dispatchers, a veteran named Carlos Martinez, immediately flagged the incident in the system. Martinez had worked in prison dispatch for 12 years and had seen his share of inappropriate officer conduct. He knew what excessive force looked like. He knew the difference between proper procedure and abuse. And he knew that what he was watching violated both department policy and federal law. Martinez immediately began recording the live feed to a secure server. He simultaneously contacted his supervisor, explaining what he was witnessing in real time on the dash cam. The supervisor, Lieutenant Sarah Johnson, arrived at the control center within minutes and watched the remaining footage with growing horror. By this time, Morrison had shoved David Chen back into the secure compartment and ordered the transport to resume. The incident had lasted approximately 8 minutes. 8 minutes of unauthorized search, inappropriate physical contact, verbal harassment, and excessive force that had been captured from multiple angles by the van's security system. The control center supervisor made a decision that would ultimately define her career. She immediately stopped the transport and contacted the FBI's Civil Rights Division with a report of potential misconduct by a federal corrections officer. She also instructed that the dashcam footage be preserved as evidence and that Officer Morrison be suspended from duty pending investigation. When the transport van arrived back at the facility 45 minutes later, Officer Morrison had no idea that his career was about to end. He stepped out of the van with Officer Mitchell, expecting a routine conclusion to another day on the job. Instead, he was met by facility administrators, internal affairs investigators, and FBI agents. Morrison was informed that he was suspended immediately and that a federal investigation had been opened into his conduct. His badge was confiscated on the spot. He was read his rights and informed that anything he said could be used against him in both criminal and administrative proceedings. The shock on Morrison's face was almost comical if the situation weren't so serious. He had spent 18 years operating under the assumption that what happened behind closed doors stayed behind closed doors. He had never imagined that someone was actually watching. He had never considered that the cameras he saw every day were actually recording not just video, but audio. He had believed himself untouchable because previous complaints had been buried. Officer Mitchell was also suspended, but her suspension was administrative pending investigation into whether she had participated in the misconduct or simply failed to prevent it. The distinction would matter significantly in determining her ultimate fate. David Chen was returned to his cell. He was debriefed by internal affairs investigators, who asked him to describe exactly what had happened during the transport. Chen provided a detailed account of Morrison's verbal harassment and physical abuse. He explained how Morrison had conducted an unnecessary and unauthorized search. He described how Morrison had shoved him against the van. He provided specific quotes from Morrison's verbal abuse. Most importantly, David Chen agreed to cooperate fully with the federal investigation and to testify if necessary in any proceedings against Morrison. Chen understood that coming forward against a corrections officer was risky. He was still incarcerated and would remain so for another 18 months. Retaliation from other officers was a real possibility. But Chen also understood that remaining silent would enable Morrison to continue abusing other inmates. The dashcam footage was immediately secured as evidence and copied to multiple locations to prevent any possibility of destruction or tampering. The FBI assigned a civil rights investigator named Special Agent Patricia Wong to lead the case. Wong had spent 14 years investigating police and corrections misconduct and had built a reputation for relentless pursuit of the truth regardless of institutional pressure. Wong began by reviewing the dashcam footage frame by frame, documenting every instance of inappropriate conduct. She created a detailed timeline of events with specific timestamps correlating to Morrison's actions. She interviewed David Chen extensively, taking his statement and obtaining details about his experience during the incident. But Wong didn't stop with just the current incident. She began investigating Morrison's employment history, reviewing all previous complaints, and examining patterns in his conduct. What she discovered was a systemic pattern of abuse that had been systematically covered up by corrections administrators for nearly 2 decades. 6 other inmates came forward after hearing about David Chen's experience. They described similar incidents with Morrison: inappropriate searches, verbal abuse, excessive force, and intimidation tactics. Some had complained at the time but were discouraged from filing formal complaints. Others had suffered in silence, assuming that complaining about a corrections officer would only make their incarceration worse. One inmate, a man named Marcus Rodriguez, described how Morrison had fractured his ribs during a supposedly routine cell inspection. Rodriguez had reported the injury to the medical staff, but when questioned about how it occurred, he had been afraid to name Morrison. He had simply said he fell in his cell. The incident had been recorded in the system as an inmate accident, not officer misconduct. Another inmate, James Washington, described how Morrison had deliberately withheld his prescribed medications for 3 days as punishment for a minor violation. Washington had a serious medical condition that required daily medication. The withholding of medication could have resulted in serious health consequences. A third inmate, Roberto Santos, described how Morrison had isolated him in segregation on false charges after Santos had complained about the quality of the food in the cafeteria. The complaint had nothing to do with Morrison, but Morrison had apparently taken it as a personal affront and used his authority to punish Santos. The pattern became undeniable. Morrison had systematically abused his authority to intimidate, humiliate, and harm inmates who either challenged his authority or simply offended his sense of superiority. He had operated with complete impunity because the institution had failed to properly investigate previous complaints. Agent Wong's investigation expanded to include the supervisors and administrators who had received and dismissed previous complaints against Morrison. She discovered that one supervisor, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, had actually coached Morrison on how to write incident reports that would justify questionable conduct. Another supervisor, Sergeant Michael Torres, had received multiple complaints, but had deliberately marked them as unfounded without proper investigation. The investigation revealed that the prison facility's Internal Affairs Division had been designed more to protect officers from accountability than to protect inmates from abuse. Complaint investigators were all correctional officers with no training in civil rights investigation. Complainants were often intimidated during the investigation process, evidence was frequently minimized or ignored. The entire system was structured to enable misconduct while creating an appearance of accountability. Federal prosecutors moved quickly to file charges against Officer Morrison. The charges included deprivation of rights under color of law, which carries up to 10 years in federal prison. Additional charges included assault and false imprisonment. Prosecutors also recommended that Morrison's peace officer certification be permanently revoked. Morrison's attorney attempted to argue that the incident was a routine security procedure that had simply become heated. This defense strategy fell apart immediately when prosecutors presented the dashcam footage showing exactly what had transpired. The footage was irrefutable. It clearly showed an unnecessary search, inappropriate physical contact, and verbal harassment that had no legitimate security purpose. Morrison's attorney then tried to argue that David Chen had resisted or acted aggressively in some way that would justify Morrison's response. But the video showed David Chen standing completely still and compliant throughout the incident. The only aggression visible was Morrison's aggression directed toward a cooperative, non-threatening inmate. The federal grand jury heard evidence from Agent Wong, David Chen, the other inmates who had come forward, and from Officer Mitchell, who testified about the incident she had witnessed. The grand jury deliberated for only 3 hours before voting to indict Morrison on all charges. Morrison faced trial in federal court, where the evidence against him was overwhelming. The dashcam footage was played in its entirety for the jury. Every inappropriate touch, every hostile comment, every unnecessary action was visible and undeniable. David Chen testified about his experience, speaking calmly about how Morrison's conduct had violated his rights and his dignity. The prosecution also presented expert testimony from Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, a corrections expert who testified about proper procedures for inmate searches and transport. Martinez explained how every action Morrison had taken violated established protocols. She described how properly trained officers conduct searches with minimal physical contact and without verbal abuse. She explained how Morrison's conduct was not only inappropriate but represented a serious violation of professional standards. Morrison's attorney called character witnesses who described him as a dedicated officer and family man, but the overwhelming evidence of his conduct made these character references seem hollow and inadequate. The jury was tasked with choosing between Morrison's claims of proper procedure and the irrefutable video evidence of inappropriate conduct. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. The courtroom remained silent as the verdict was read. Morrison's face went pale as he realized that his career was over and that federal prison was now his likely destination. The sentencing hearing took place 3 months later. The federal judge, Judge Catherine Monroe, had reviewed hundreds of pages of evidence documenting not just the current incident, but Morrison's entire history of abuse spanning 18 years. Judge Monroe was particularly disturbed by the systematic failure of the prison system to address known problems. In her sentencing statement, Judge Monroe called Morrison's conduct a grave betrayal of the public trust and a violation of the constitutional rights of a person in custody. She explained that correctional officers occupy a position of significant authority and that this authority carries corresponding responsibility to treat inmates humanely and in accordance with law. Judge Monroe sentenced Officer Morrison to 8 years in federal prison. She also imposed a lifetime ban on any employment in law enforcement or corrections. Morrison would emerge from prison as a convicted felon without any prospect of returning to the profession that had defined his adult life. The sentencing also included an order for Morrison to pay restitution to David Chen in the amount of $150,000 for the violation of his rights and the trauma he had experienced. The restitution order was primarily symbolic. Morrison would likely never pay the full amount, but it represented an official acknowledgement that compensation was owed for the harm caused. But Morrison's criminal conviction was just the beginning of the consequences. The investigation into Morrison's conduct triggered a broader examination of the entire corrections facility. The FBI expanded its investigation to include the supervisors and administrators who had covered up Morrison's misconduct for years. Lieutenant Robert Hayes faced federal charges for conspiracy and willful blindness to civil rights violations. The evidence showed that Hayes had actively participated in covering up complaints against Morrison. Prosecutors argued that Hayes had coached Morrison on how to write incident reports that would obscure misconduct. Sergeant Michael Torres faced similar charges for failing to properly investigate complaints and for deliberately marking complaints as unfounded. The facility's director, Michael Anderson, was placed under federal investigation for maintaining policies and procedures that enabled officer misconduct. Anderson had been aware of previous complaints against Morrison, but had taken no meaningful action. He had prioritized protecting the facility's reputation over protecting inmates' constitutional rights. The Department of Justice launched a broad investigation into the facility's culture and practices. Federal investigators interviewed dozens of inmates, correctional officers, and administrators. They reviewed years of complaint records and internal affairs investigations. What they discovered was a systematic pattern of misconduct and cover-up that extended far beyond just Officer Morrison. The investigation revealed that at least 15 other correctional officers at the facility had patterns of abuse that were never properly addressed. There were inmates with documented injuries that had never been properly investigated. There were medical records showing inmates who had been denied prescribed medications as punishment. There was evidence of inmates being placed in segregation on false charges. Most damaging was the discovery of a culture within the facility that discouraged inmates from filing complaints and that punished inmates who did complain. Inmates understood that reporting misconduct could result in retaliation from officers, transfers to worse facilities, or denial of privileges. This created an environment where abuse could flourish essentially unchecked. The Justice Department issued a scathing report detailing systemic problems at the facility and recommending comprehensive reforms. The report called for replacement of facility leadership, implementation of new accountability procedures, and mandatory training on constitutional policing and inmates' rights. Most significantly, the Justice Department imposed a consent decree requiring federal oversight of the facility for the next 5 years. Every policy, procedure, and significant personnel action would be subject to federal approval. The facility would be required to implement body cameras for all officer interactions with inmates. An independent oversight board would investigate all inmate complaints. The financial implications were enormous. The facility's budget was increased significantly to cover the cost of federal oversight and new compliance measures. The city found itself responsible for settlements to multiple inmates who had experienced abuse. David Chen received his $150,000 restitution payment, but other inmates also filed civil suits against the facility. One inmate, Marcus Rodriguez, whose ribs had been fractured by Morrison, received a settlement of $200,000 for his injuries and emotional distress. Other inmates received smaller settlements ranging from $25,000 to $100,000 depending on the severity of their abuse. The total cost to the city exceeded $1.5 million in settlements alone. The facility's leadership was effectively dismantled. Director Michael Anderson was forced into early retirement. Lieutenant Robert Hayes and Sergeant Michael Torres were convicted and imprisoned. Officer Morrison remained imprisoned, his career in corrections permanently ended by a single incident captured on a dash cam that he had apparently forgotten existed. But perhaps the most significant impact was on prison culture nationally. Morrison's case became required study material in corrections training programs across the country. New officers learned about constitutional responsibilities and proper procedures by studying Morrison's case as an example of what not to do. The case demonstrated that federal oversight was a real possibility for facilities that failed to maintain proper standards. Officer Sarah Mitchell, who had witnessed the misconduct but failed to prevent it, received a suspension but ultimately was allowed to return to work with mandatory additional training on ethical conduct and an understanding that future failures to report misconduct would result in termination. Mitchell's experience served as a reminder to other officers that complicity in misconduct could have serious career consequences. David Chen was released from prison after serving his sentence. He became an advocate for inmates' rights and for reforms in the corrections system. He spoke publicly about his experience with Morrison and about the broader culture of abuse that he had witnessed during his incarceration. His advocacy helped build public support for further reforms in the corrections system. The dashcam footage that had captured Officer Morrison's abuse became symbolic of the power of documentation and transparency. The existence of the camera and the real-time monitoring by dispatchers had prevented years of continued abuse from going undetected. The footage demonstrated that when misconduct is documented and preserved, accountability becomes possible even in institutions designed to protect themselves from scrutiny. Agent Patricia Wong continued her work investigating corrections misconduct at facilities across the country. The techniques and investigative methods she had developed during the Morrison investigation became standard procedure for federal civil rights investigations in corrections settings. Wong's work contributed to a broader movement toward accountability in corrections institutions that had traditionally operated with little external oversight. The story of Officer Morrison became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and institutional failure to maintain accountability. His single moment of careless abuse, captured on a dashcam that he had failed to consider, cost him his career, his freedom, and his reputation. But more importantly, his case triggered reforms that protected countless future inmates from experiencing similar abuse. Morrison's case proved that in the age of documentation and federal oversight, misconduct cannot remain hidden indefinitely. The dashcam footage that Morrison had apparently forgotten existed became the evidence that destroyed him and exposed a broken system that had failed to protect vulnerable people in custody. The consequences of his one bad move extended far beyond his personal punishment. They encompassed systemic reform, institutional change, and a message to corrections officers nationwide that abuse of authority would not be tolerated, regardless of how powerful or protected individuals thought they were. Officer James Morrison learned too late that the cameras were always watching, that the system could be held accountable, and that one moment of careless misconduct could end everything he thought he had built over 18 years in corrections.